Hello, my name is Laura Dietz. Welcome to Lunches Lit with Joshua Whitehead and Alicia Elliott. I would like to begin by acknowledging that we are on the traditional lands referred to as Treaty 4 territory, and that this festival is located on Treaty 4 territory. Dietz. Welcome to Lunches Lit with Joshua White. I just realized I can't have YouTube going in the background because you guys will all hear that as well. Sorry about that. I forgot to turn the volume down. So we are located on Treaty 4 territory, the original lands of the Cree, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Dakota, Lakota, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. The festival is dedicated to making this a safe space for everyone. Any hateful language will not be tolerated in the events or in the chat on YouTube. Also, this festival would not be possible without the support of our major funders. So, sorry about that. So we would like to thank the Saskatchewan Arts Board, SaskCulture, Saskatchewan Lotteries, Canada Council for the Arts, and the Government of Canada, as well as a long list of program funders that will be shown at the end of this event. If you're in a business that you know supports the festival, please be sure to thank them for their support. I'm very excited to be here today. The only thing that could possibly be better is if we were here in person. I would like to introduce Joshua and Alicia. They will be reading some selections from the books, and then we will come back and discuss. So please get your questions ready early. I have a long list as well, so be sure to get your questions in, and I will be monitoring the YouTube chat. So if you have any questions or comments, we can have some interaction there as well. So we have decided through random draw that Joshua is going to start our reading. Joshua Whitehead is an OG Cree Two-Spirit storyteller and an academic from Peguis First Nation on Treaty 1 territory in Manitoba. He is currently working toward a PhD in Indigenous Literatures and Cultures at the University of Calgary on Treaty 7 territory. Joshua is the author of Johnny Appleseed, which was longlisted for the Giller Prize, shortlisted for a Governor General, the Amazon First Novel Prize, and winner of the 2019 Lambda Literary Award for Gay Fiction. His poetry collection, Full Metal Indigiqueer, was shortlisted for the Indigenous Voices Award and the Stephen J. Stephenson Award for Poetry. I can't wait to hear your work. Go ahead.
Thanks, Laurie. Thank you to the Saskatchewan Festival of Words. I'm so excited to be here with Alicia. Prior to this, we were gabbing, and we actually did rock, paper, scissors to figure out who went first. So I lost. So here I am. I thought I would read a couple sections from Johnny and Tias, who are kind of maybe the two primary characters in this novel. Since we're all in quarantine, or hopefully we should be, and we're all quite lonely, and I'm sure we're all a little thirsty, so I thought I'd read some fun scenes for us. I made my way down to Tias's house and snuck in through his window. We were both masters at popping out window screens without breaking them. See, if you slide a butter knife in between the screen and the window frame and then wiggle it back and forth, you can pop out the bottom plugs that click it into place. From there on, you can push it in with your hands. In fact, Indians have hacked a million tools out of everyday objects. You can use a coat hanger as a toaster if you bend it into a V and place it on top of an element. It makes some damn good Indian toast, I'll tell you that. I crawled in through the window and fell on top of Tias on the bed. You awake? I jokingly asked, and he nudged me in the ribs. His skin was a dusky hue in the pale, luminescent light. I saw he was reading some book by Charles Dickens. What's that about? I asked, rubbing the wrinkled spine of the book. You know that Christmas movie about Donald Duck and those three ghosts? I nodded. It's that, but, not Disney. You wouldn't like it. Feeling insulted, I dug around his room as he kept reading. There was a copy of Ariel on the floor, open to a story titled Daddy. I wondered if he had a fetish for older men. I turned my attention to his closet. There were crumpled jeans, a few shirts, these red wall books with mice fighting other mice on the cover, and a bundle of fabric tied together with elastics. I untied it and found this old rabbit plush toy wrapped up inside it. It had a brown body with a white belly and blue eyes that were hot glued onto its head. Its left ear had been torn off and was held in place with a pin. I've had him pretty much all my life, Tia said. Floppy is his name. My grandpa gave him to me when I was a boy. Well, I mean, one of my foster grandpas, not my biological. He was this old Polish man, survived the war and everything. Just a real hard ass. This guy is sure beat up, I laughed. Heck, that even the half of it. What do you mean? Here, throw him here. I tossed it over to him and he plugged his right neck tight. See these stitches? He had his head ripped off from one of my first foster placements. I lived on this farm with the Ukrainian family just a few miles outside the res. They raised cattle and our neighbor had an ostrich farm. I used to play with them all the time and I'd bring flock. We'd go up to their pens and feed them seeds. When I teased them, they'd ruffle their feathers and start running in circles. Then one time, one of those goddamn ostriches stretched his long ass neck out and plucked Flop straight from my hands. He ran around the pen and all the other birds just nipped at him. And I guess these two birds got into a fight over Flop. They ripped his head clean off. My foster mom later went and collected his head, his body, and his gutted innards. She stitched him back up for me. I wasn't allowed near the birds after that. I laughed. That's crazy. Like that's some Looney Tunes realness. Tia sat quietly and cradled his plush. Sorry, Tius, I said after a few minutes of silence. Shit's rough. But hey, you still got this little guy. Yeah, he said. Little guy's the toughest son of I've ever met. Been through hell and back and is still here. It's a fucking mess. He laughed. But every mess on his body has a funny story behind it. I climbed into bed beside him, nuzzled my head between his armpit and his pectoral. He wasn't wearing deodorant, but I kind of liked his stink. It was one of his sexiest attributes. I laid my left arm and leg over his body, and he rested his chin on my forehead. Oh, yeah? I said. You gotta tell me sometime. Little by little, he interjected. Little by little. As we began to fall asleep, I thought about that Dickens book he was reading. He was right. I didn't care for it, but that doesn't mean I hadn't read it. I think Ebenezer and I had a lot in common. We both liked money, and we both liked to screw. And weren't we both haunted by ghosts? Tell me one, I whispered to Tias. Okay, he yawned, but I don't know where to begin. To begin with, I suggested. Yeah? To begin with, you got an ass laden with wood. Echo say, he laughed. You don't say, I replied, in between kisses knitted with girlish laughter. We got out after what seemed like hours, shivering in the lake wind. We laid on the beach naked, our cocks and balls shriveled into themselves. We must have looked like aliens there. No genitals, just flat, sexless bodies. The night was thick, so we lit our sparklers, the flakes of metal flaring between us, touching our skin, burning for a second, leaving marks like hickeys on our chests and our legs. Then we kissed, our chins above a heat that scorched our budding hairs, his lips tasting of stale water and crinkled like tinfoil. But our heads fit together without having to twist much. When I bit his lip, my teeth caught some dead skin, which I pulled into my mouth. He tasted like the salty skin of a pickerel. Fuck, he said, pulling away, his lip shiny with a single bead of blood. Sorry, man, I said. My tooth got caught. Sand had crusted on our bodies, found its way into our bottoms, powdered scrotums like a shake and bake my cookum put on chicken. Don't worry about it, man, but fuck, that hurt, he said, as he wiped himself with the back of his hand and then stared at it. Should probably get back anyways, you know. We threw on our shorts and tees and wrapped our towels over our heads to dry our hair, but truth be told, I thought mine looked like a luxurious war bonnet. On our way back, we got lost as we pushed our way through a path Tias called a shortcut. The long arms of branches slapping at us and the sharp needles of thistle weeds underfoot. I know the way, Tias said, unconvincingly. Echoes, I said. You know, I read this poem today, he said, while basically holding two branches apart so I could walk through them. Basically about this right here. The woods are scary, dark and deep, he recited, inflecting the final two words to try and scare me. I wasn't scared, but I did pretend to jump just to please him. He put his hands on his hips like a confident warrior, but I thought he looked more like a jester than anything. We continued along the path, Tias leading the way like a bulldozer. Hey, Tias, I said, putting my hand on his shoulder. You never did finish your story from the other night. He turned around. Yeah, well, what about it? Well, can I hear it? He stared at me for a second, then turned his head back and continued down the path. I didn't say anything, I just followed close behind him, our gaits matching and hands sometimes smacking into one another. Our feet were beginning to feel bruised, but he said he still knew how to get back. I trusted him since he came here more often than I did, and there's a kind of safety in letting someone else lead the way. Still, it's funny how your mind plays tricks on you in the dark. Everything looks like it's ready to pounce on you, to grab you, to shake and slap you. The third time our hands bumped together, he grabbed my hand, laced his fingers through mine, and pulled me along like a string. I have this picture, he said, pulling me in closer, our hips almost aligned. She's a baby. I didn't want to respond this time. I knew I'd fuck it all up. I knew I'd betray his trust again. I needed to listen fiercely and respond through my body. We're sitting together on this lawn. I don't know where it is. I squeeze the meat of his thumb. She's sitting between my legs, like maybe 3 months or something. I'm maybe two. I continue to squeeze the ball of his hand like they taught me at Camp Arnaz. She's so goddamn tiny, you know. Squeeze it like they taught me after we sang Johnny Appleseed Amen. We're just hugging each other, and her fingers are so little and pink, and every time I look at them, I see how dark my own knuckles are. I know I haven't fought enough in my life for them to be that black, you know. I'm squeezing SOS into his palm like I'm pressing an orange. And then I look at hers and see that hers are not much lighter than mine. I squeeze a different word that Lewis, the camp counselor, taught me with the grinding of his hips into mine. Watch T.S.'s body crumple like a piece of paper in a fire. Why are they so dark, John? Why are they so dark? Then all of a sudden, T.S. is hunched over crying and his palm goes limp. I pull him into me, wrap my arms around him like an oyster. I kiss his forehead and he looks up at me, his lashes clumped together with tears. Why did I have to lose her too? He asks. I have no answers for him other than this is the way it is for Indians. But that's the truth I don't have to repeat to him. I think I see it, I say, take both his hands into mine, pull him upright like I'm a powerful ox all of a sudden. You know what the fucked up thing is, he says, wiping his eyes. When I showed my parents, they said she looked cute enough to eat. Who the fuck says that? I steered the both of us in the direction of the path again, and this time I led the way, pulling Tias along with all my might. We didn't say anything else to each other that night, but as I churned those images over and over and over in my head, I heard him whisper to himself, miles to go before I sleep. Tia stayed the night. When I woke up, I decided not to tell him that I was headed back to the res. The sun was rising and beating down through my blinds. I traced his body with my forefinger as he lay sleeping, from his chest that rose and fell to the bottom of his rib cage to the round rise of his hips. I put my ear to his navel, half expecting to hear something, before slipping my tongue inside of it, wanting to taste Nana Bojo's elixir. Tias woke up and looked down at me. Without a word, we took each other in our mouths, ending with a final plume of cum that slid between our pressed bodies. We didn't bother wiping ourselves. We just laid on our backs, his hand in mine, both of us staring at the ceiling and breathing in the hay-scented air. We're gonna keep it, John. I pressed my thumb into the ball of his hand again. I wanted to feel the ridges on his palm, see if his lines were still broken like mine. Where mine were cracked and frayed, his made an M shape that took up his entire hand. I brought his hand to my face and I could still smell the beer and cigarettes. I've been working on finishing my grade 12, you know, bettering myself and shit. I curled my body around his left side and his arm pulled me in closer. And you haven't been around all that much lately, you know. I could feel my phone vibrating beneath the pillow. I pulled it out and saw the yellow glow from a new client. Manitou, I prayed. Give me the strength not to check my Snapchat right now. Did you hear what I said? We're gonna keep the baby, John. I nodded into his armpit and pulled him in tighter. I inhaled his stink and then licked him. I wanted to taste him, consume him, remember him. We wrapped our arms and legs around each other, our heads burrowed into the other's neck like an Ouroboros, as tears started streaking down our faces. We used to love holding each other like that. We even made our own verb to describe it, burritoing. Want a burrito? He'd ask, and we'd link together and fall asleep that way. The world breaks everyone, Tias whispered into my ear. And after, well, heck, those that make it through are strong at the broken places. He ran his fingers through my hair and lightly grazed my neck with his lips. Hemingway, he said with pride. Gotta read him for my GED. Should read him sometime. I nodded and pushed my head against the curve of his fingers. I'm gonna finish and get myself straight, John. You know, learn a trade or something. For the baby and Jordan and shit. He kissed my forehead and got out of the bed. The sun was rising higher in the sky, heading toward noon. I guess this is goodbye, eh? He said, putting on his shirt. You mean echo say? I mean, you don't say, he laughed. I smiled and nodded. My pigeon friend was stirring outside my window, flapping its wings awake. Someone was pushing a shopping cart down the back alley, rickety wings scraping pavement. Get home, he asked. Echo say, I replied. He unlatched the door and looked back at me, his eyes full of regret. There, I thought, that's the T.S. I know. When I tried to kiss him one last time, he turned his head. My lips met the brisk hairs on his neck. The rain won't make any difference, I said. What? He said, looking confused, but I closed the door without responding. When I heard his footsteps disappear down the hallway, I went back to bed and checked my phone. But all I wanted to do was stay between these sheets and forget. I breathed in Tias's scent that he left on my pillowcases. I guess I was happy for him. Tias could make a home here in Winnipeg, him and his books. I still wasn't sure that what I had was truly mine. All I had was this bed, this wad of bills, and these cum stains on my sheets, this pool of ectoplasm that proclaimed we were here. Thank you.
Thanks, Josh. That was fantastic. I almost regret only asking for 15 minutes. All I can think is, how is it I can just love your voice so much? Even when you're talking about cocks and balls, I'm just like, oh, it's fantastic. Thank you. Okay, on to our next author, Alicia Elliott. Alicia, since your book first come out, I have been so excited to read it, but it's one of those, I bought it and it sat in my bookshelf for about 4 or 5 months at least. And I spent the last couple months reading it, or weeks reading it, and I just loved every word. I've highlighted. I'm not a big highlighter in books, but I have highlighted many parts in your book here. So Alicia Elliott is a Mohawk writer living in Brantford, Ontario with her husband and son. Her writing has been published by the Washington Post, The Walrus, CBC, Maclean's, and many others. She was the 2017-2018 Jeffrey and Margaret Andrews Fellow at UBC and recipient of the 2018 RBC Taylor Emerging Writer Prize. Her best-selling book of essays, A Mind Spread on the Ground, was nominated for the Hilary Weston Prize. I'm so excited to be here with you virtually, Alicia. For you.
Okay, can you hear me? Okay, good. I just have to say before I go on that, like, oh my God, listening to Josh read Johnny Appleseed's one of my favorite books just like ever. So, and I love that scene in particular. Like, I feel like that's the heart of the book for me, is like that scene. So just hearing you read it was amazing. And actually I was gonna read something else, but then I was like, oh, well, I think I'm gonna read something that I feel like kind of is correlating to the sexiness of what Josh laid down, but maybe not quite as sexy, because I'm still coming into the blooms of the sexiness. So in my writing, I'm still trying to get onto Josh's level. Okay, so what I'm going to read from is Sontag and Snapshots, which is kind of like a little bit more of an experimental essay that I wrote, where basically I took an essay by Susan Sontag called In Plato's Cave, and then I kind of would like take little sections and kind of write back to them, because she wrote it in the 70s and I was reading it in 2018 when I was writing this. So I'm going to start with just the beginning, and I'm just going to read certain sections. So this is going to be kind of like a different version of the essay, because it's going to, you'll see. Anyways, it reads different in the book. This is Susan Sontag. In teaching us a new visual code, photographs alter and enlarge our notions of what is worth looking at and what we have a right to observe. They are an ethics of seeing. And here's me. I started to dodge cameras around the age of 10. Photos, I thought, were reserved for preserving images of the beautiful. I was not beautiful. I was ugly, and therefore not worth being immortalized on film or, more recently, in digital images. Anytime I saw myself in a photo at one specific moment or one specific angle, I felt sick. Why did they take that picture? I'd wonder. Who would want to look at an ugly girl like me? I didn't even want to look at me. Despite my tendency to avoid pictures, when I was 18, I realized the more I tried to be avoiding being photographed, the more people tried to photograph me. It was like a game to them. It didn't matter that I didn't like being photographed. It didn't matter that they were my friends. They were gonna get a picture of me. They were gonna prove to me that getting my picture taken wasn't so bad. These people would eventually get their picture, but they never proved anything to me about photos. All they proved to me was that their desire to have an image of me was more important to them than what I wanted. This was their ethics of seeing me. I had no power over it. I stopped resisting photos after that. I wouldn't pose, I wouldn't smile. I'd make an intentionally ugly face to stop myself from criticizing what I thought of as my unintentionally ugly face. And then I'm going to move just a little bit further into the essay. So this is Sontag. From its start, photography implied the capture of the largest possible number of subjects. Painting never had so imperial a scope. And this is me. The magnitude of photography, the way it aims to capture everything, does indeed seem to have an imperial scope. It's even more pervasive now than when Sontag wrote her book. Technology has infiltrated our lives with cameras, allowing us every opportunity to take thousands of pictures of ourselves and others whenever the desire strikes. Sontag claimed back in 1973 that photography's popularity meant that it was not practiced by most people as art. But one has to only look at the popularity of Instagram, photo editing apps, and cell phones with very high quality cameras to see this assertion holds little weight today. People not only want to take pictures of their everyday lives, they want to craft and manipulate them until they look like they were taken by professionals. The term selfie was coined by an Australian man in 2002, yet perhaps unsurprisingly, the cultural stigma surrounding selfies seems proportional to how popular they are with women. It's an interesting bit of bullshit. Women can be the subject of millions of paintings hung in galleries, often painted by men. Women can be in varying states of undress in photos used for advertisements, often photographed by men. Women can appear in films, TV shows, fashion spreads, porn, often shot, directed, and edited by men. Women's bodies can be posed and prodded and digitally manipulated until they look nothing like the real women who stood in front of the camera. That's all fine. But if a woman puts on makeup, takes a picture of herself for herself, adds a filter or two and posts it to Instagram, men comment that this is why you can't trust women, that women are engaging in false advertising, that all men should take women swimming on the first date to see how they really look under all that makeup and Photoshop. Of course, it's not just men who hate women who post selfies. I used to be a selfie hater too. I would scroll through social media, resentment and indignation welling in my chest as picture after picture of smiling women or sexy women or serious women or goofy women came up on my screen. I was always the most annoyed at women who were trying to look sexy or beautiful in their selfies. What narcissists, I thought, choking down on my own insecurity. It was only when I decided I didn't have to see myself as ugly that I actively interrogated this impulse. Why was I tearing down these women, many of whom were my coworkers, my acquaintances, my friends? What was so wrong with them feeling good about the way they looked? For exerting control over their own image in a world that insisted control should never belong to them? For getting validation that they were, in the words of Rachel Syme, worthy of being seen? I started taking photos of myself. It did make me feel beautiful. It did make me see myself as worthy of being seen. But I still wouldn't share my selfies with anyone else. In her brilliant essay, Selfie, The Revolutionary Potential of Your Own Face in 7 chapters, Rachel Syme defines a selfie as having to be shared in order to be considered a selfie. I balked at this initially. Weren't my selfies selfies? Why did I have to share pictures of myself when I was taking them solely for my own satisfaction? Then I remembered the shame, the ugliness that I felt back when I was a kid who refused to have my picture taken. How I was convinced no one would want to ever see a picture of me. How I hated seeing pictures of myself. Even though I was almost 2 decades older and I had embarked on a project to see myself as beautiful, very little had changed. I still thought keeping pictures of myself from others was, in a sense, sparing them. If photography has a scope we would call imperial, what would we call something as ingrained and unavoidable as shame? Perhaps we should also call it imperial. After all, haven't the Western, white-centric beauty standards that have made us feel inadequate and shameful in the first place been spread through imperialism? Though Britain can no longer claim most of the world as its empire, the colonialism it introduced, the beauty standards it introduced, linger. Skin lightening creams are enthusiastically bought and sold on every single continent to those who don't have the right, read white, skin tone. A painful hours-long process exists for Black women to chemically straighten their hair so it looks more professional, read white. Plastic surgeries are available to change the eyelids of East Asian women from monolids to, quote, beautiful, read Western, white eyelids. Even among white women, there are standards to be upheld. Large breasts, no cellulite, thin waist, straight teeth, clear skin, bleached assholes. These standards didn't appear out of thin air. Someone somewhere decided they would hire a Black actress with Eurocentric features and light skin over a Black actress with wide hips and dark skin. And then another someone somewhere did the same. And then another, and another, and another. This has happened ad nauseum across every other possible category one can think of: race, gender, age, sexuality, body size, physical ability. This is how beauty becomes an imperial project. Those who are considered beautiful, according to these standards, are also considered inherently more valuable than those who aren't. When a thin, pretty white girl like John Benet Ramsey is found dead, it ignites fury and indignation that spans decades, still important enough to warrant cover stories in 2018 tabloids. When a gorgeous award-nominated Indigenous actress just breaking it big in Hollywood named Misty Upton goes missing, the local police don't even look for her. Her family have to organize the search party themselves, eventually finding her body 10 days after they file the missing person report. In a world where beauty equals worth, not being the right kind of beautiful has material consequences on the quality of your life and your death. That's what's so revolutionary about the rise of platforms like YouTube, Twitter, and Instagram. The old gatekeepers are becoming obsolete. The only person that can decide who deserves to be seen and valued now is the person who is uploading content. This means that communities that were once considered This means that communities that were once considered below appealing to are visible in a way they never were before, which also means they can make their interests known in ways they never could before. And this increased visibility seems to be working. Rihanna's beauty line Fenty Beauty launched in 2017 with a nearly unheard of, at the time, 40 foundation shades, then proceeded to sell out many of the darkest shades for months, sending an immediate message to all the rest of the beauty industry: appeal to all skin tones, value all skin tones, or get left behind. Black Panther, which was written and directed by Ryan Coogler, a Black man, and featured an almost entirely Black cast, took in a box office total of $242.1 million on opening weekend, then sustained its success to become the third film in history to pass the $700 million mark in the US. This went against everything film executives claimed about the drawing power of Black directors and Black stars. It was no surprise to Black people, though, as they'd been anticipating the film for months, sharing photos and memes on Twitter and Instagram of themselves getting ready to see the film opening night. Conversely, the social media reaction to Hollywood films that have whitewashed characters of color, casting Scarlett Johansson as a Japanese woman in Ghost in the Shell, Emma Stone as a Hawaiian and Asian woman in Aloha, and Christian Bale as an Egyptian prince in Exodus, for example, coincided with poor domestic box office performances. It would seem then that since social media is controlled by everyday people, allowing diverse viewpoints and representations to have a platform every second of every day, people no longer have to accept the discrimination of mainstream media and big industry. It's important to remember that appealing to capitalism to fix the problems of racism, sexism, ageism, ableism, transphobia, and homophobia is problematic in its own way. Capitalism always relies upon exploitation to create profit, and therefore it must always rely upon differing valuations of people's humanity. Still, every time I click on a native hashtag and see pride reflected back instead of shame, I know that we have a good start. I recently came across a passage in Leo Tolstoy's essay, What is Art? He says, art is not, as the metaphysicians say, the manifestation of some mysterious idea of beauty or God. It is not, as the aesthetical physiologists say, a game in which man lets off his excess of stored up energy. It is not the expression of man's emotions by external signs. It is not the production of pleasing objects. And above all, it is not pleasure, but it is a means of union among men, joining them together in the same feelings and indispensable for the life and progress toward well-being of individuals and of humanity. Selfies do that. Each person who posts a photo of themselves online pushes back against imperial beauty standards and profit-driven gatekeepers, joining online communities that are built on our mutual understandings of how shame has impacted us. If posting selfies online means that we temporarily feel good about ourselves in a society that requires us to feel bad to make money, if it encourages us to refuse the idea that we need to change ourselves to fit impossible molds, isn't that indispensable for our progress? Isn't it indispensable for our collective well-being? And then I just have this really cute little tiny little guy I'm just going to finish off with. And I feel like it kind of closes out, even though the essay is longer, like I said, it kind of closes out this little section. So this is Sontag. Photographs can abet desire in the most direct, utilitarian way. As when someone collects photographs of anonymous examples of the desirable as an aid to masturbation. Desire has no history, at least it is experienced in each instance as all foreground, immediacy. And here's me. First things first, desire definitely has a history. Its history is intertwined with beauty standards that reinforce systemic oppressions. Colonialism, sexism, racism, ableism, homophobia, transphobia, as well as being intertwined with rape culture, or, if you prefer, a culture of non-consent. The desire of cisgendered heterosexual white men has not only been historically used to evaluate the worth of women, two-spirit people, and non-binary folks, it has also been continually wielded as a weapon against us, targeting our respective bodies with sexual and physical violence, as well as murder and genocide. The idea that desire's immediacy somehow removes it from this specific painful history is absurd. In fact, it is that very immediacy that often excuses violence against us, playing into the rhetoric that a violent man simply couldn't help himself or got caught up in the moment. It is with this history in mind that we should examine the rise in revenge porn and celebrity nude pics, which I consider two sides of the same coin. Revenge porn is exactly what it sounds like. A man encourages a woman he's seeing to send him nude pictures of herself. She complies. When they break up, the man posts her nudes all over the internet without her consent. The thing is, not all revenge porn is done after a breakup. When I was in university, I sometimes hung out with a group of guys my husband had befriended. They were all traditionally nerdy, liked video games, Star Wars, comic books, etc. Of the 5 or 6 of them, my husband was the only one in a relationship. I was always uncomfortable around them. It felt to me like they didn't see me as a person. They talk around me, never asking my opinion, some rarely acknowledging my presence at all. I tried telling this to my husband, but I didn't want to alienate him from his friends. I couldn't really put my finger on what was bothering me anyway. But then my husband found out that one of them had a new girlfriend and had shown the other guys her nudes. Sorry, that's my pup. It's okay, Sam. I immediately understood my discomfort. This man had been dating her for a short time, and he already felt he had the right to share her body with his friends without her consent. Her body was a type of social capital for him, and sharing photos of it with his friends was a way of sharing and flaunting his wealth. These men were never outright rude to me when I was with them. Their ignoring me wasn't any different than what I'd expected from most men. But if I'd taken a nude photo of myself and they saw it, would they see me as even more of an object and less of a human than they already did? Would their eyes glaze over as they looked, my image joining the ever-expanding category of naked women's images they'd cataloged in their minds? Would they tell themselves that looking at my photo was the same thing as looking at porn? At least porn stars know their photos will be looked at by strangers. At least they choose for their naked bodies to be photographed and for those photographs to be shared. Theoretically. I thought about finding out who this man's girlfriend was and telling her what he'd done. I knew she had a right to know who she was dealing with, to protect herself. Instead, I distanced myself from this group of men, never saying a word to anyone about their revenge porn bonding session, making a promise to myself to not take any nudes, not even for my husband. Not because there's anything wrong with the photographs themselves, but because you never really knew what a man would do with them. Any man, even the man you trusted most in the world. There really is no better term for it than revenge porn, even when the man who carries it out is still in a relationship with the woman he's exploiting, even when he doesn't have a reason to be enacting revenge. Every act of sharing pictures of a woman's body without her consent is an act of revenge. As with the often male hatred leveled at selfies, the hatred that leads someone to turn a private photo into revenge porn is a specifically misogynistic type of hatred. The woman is hated for daring to make a sexual photo of herself, despite the fact that often the man she's sending her picture to asked her for it. The woman is hated for daring to control the way a man sees and experiences her body, for having sexual agency, for seeing herself as sexy, for having a sexuality independent of that man. This is the same mentality that fuels the rabid demand for nude pics of celebrities. Every time a woman's private photos are leaked without her consent, straight men rejoice at a new trove of pictures to jack off to, collectively reveling in the violation necessary for those photos to still be available. The violation that makes these photos so scintillating to them in the first place. I'm so sorry. There seems to be someone who is using like a giant, it sounds like a chainsaw or some sort of sanding device. I'm almost done with this, and then I will hit mute, and then we'll see what happens. But anyways, I'm almost done. They're sexier than the nude photos celebrities agree to pose for, or the love scenes they agree to appear in. They're more dangerous. Why? Because the woman whose naked body you're looking at did not want you to see them. The immediacy with which hacked celebrity nude pics are posted to the internet and downloaded onto millions of hard drives, regardless of the immorality of it, says more about the connections between photography, desire, history, and immediacy than anything else ever could. After all, these men simply couldn't help themselves, could they? And I'll just leave it there.
Thank you so much, Alicia. That was great. There's so many things that I love about your essays. I love that you talk about everything in one essay and how you do that to me. And it makes sense that you do that to me. It's that whole interconnectedness. Like for Indigenous people, like everything's kind of connected, right? So to separate it doesn't make a lot of sense. But in non-Indigenous writing, it's like everything's always broken down. So I like that you have that all together. And it's like, I was just writing down some of the issues you touched on, and there's so many of them: whitewashing characters in Hollywood, literature, academics, advocacy, capitalism, pain, genocide, healing, racism, revenge porn, like all in that 15-minute reading. That's amazing. Okay, so make sure to get your questions in. We'll maybe read some comments if we have time, but I have tons of questions, so I don't know how much time we'll have. First off, I want to talk about the titles on your book for one reason. Alicia, I know you talk about it in your book, so if you don't know why your book is named A Mind Spread on the Ground, that means you haven't read the book and you better read the book. But I'd love for you to talk about that, Alicia, as well. Of course, Joshua, Johnny Appleseed, and why Johnny Appleseed. And I love the cover of your book. I love that beadwork on it. It's beautiful. So, Alicia, do you want to go first? We'll kind of go back and forth. And
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so I'm actually really terrible at naming pieces of writing, or like I feel a lot of anxiety about it. Like I know, like I don't really think about it at first, and so I'll just write something, and most of the time, I'll just title the file with whatever music I'm listening to, like a song. I'll just be like, eh. So that was kind of. I don't even remember what the original title I saved the essay of mine spread it on the ground as, but I remember when I had sent it because basically, like the whole story about it is kind of funny because basically, I had met Leanne Simpson at the Banff Center, and she had heard me read a creative nonfiction piece that I had written about being pregnant, which is in the book as well. And she basically she liked the reading, and she kind of just reached out to me because she was editing, or like there were 3 editors that were editing an all Indigenous section or version of the Malahat Review, and she was doing the creative nonfiction section. So she was like, Alicia, I'm editing this and I don't see any submissions from you, so like, are you submit something? And I was like, yes, because I mean, when Leanne Simpson asks you personally to submit something, you submit something. So I started writing something for that specifically because she asked me to. And then she ended up, when I sent it in, she ended up accepting it, which was really great. And then I was just like, Leanne, I'm really bad at titles. I don't know what to call this. Can you give me some suggestions? And she came up with a series of titles. And one of them was Her Mind Spread Out on the Ground. And I was like, oh, that's very close. I just want it to be A Mind Spread Out on the Ground, and that's the one. And that's kind of how we came to that title. And so then from there, when I was thinking of what to title the whole collection, I just couldn't, I was like, that's the title, A Mind Spread Out on the Ground, because that's how I imagine the collection to be, is just kind of like me thinking through things. And like, I kind of imagine the reader is kind of standing back and looking at me, kind of putting these puzzle pieces together for them, of my own life, of the world. And I wanted them to kind of be able to stand back and kind of look at it. And so that was kind of how that all came together. I'm terrible at coming up with titles, but Leanne Simpson is not. So that is the more.
great, thanks, Josh.
That's so funny because I think the very first bit of Johnny was also in that Malahat Indigenous.
Yes, it was. I remember reading it.
With Richard Van Camp was like,
yes!
This was great. You submit something. So it's so funny. I just like thinking briefly on that. Like there's like you, me, like so many of them, Billy Ray Belcourt, like the Indigenous writers we kind of have now in this, whatever we are, this emerging breath. We're like kind of brought on board, not all, but some of us were like brought on board by like, the aunties and uncles of Indigenous lit, right?
Yes.
Leanne, Richard. Oh, that's so crazy. I didn't think about that. So Johnny was that was Johnny's first little bit, and I just didn't know what to title either. So it's like, here's his name, Johnny Appleseed Part 1, quotation marks. So like that was the story or the title of the piece. But I was actually just talking with my mother and sister. We were talking about like our childhoods and camp culture, like going to like summer camps or day camps. And I was like, oh yeah, like, do you remember going to Camp Arnez, which I read a little bit from today? And my sister was like, no, I didn't go. And I was like, oh, like it's like the kind of sing-song kind of saying grace anthem of like, oh, the Lord is good to me, and so I thank the Lord for giving me the life I need. And it ends with Johnny Appleseed, amen. And I was like 8 or 9 when I went to this camp, and it's like still stuck in my head. Like we had to sing it before breakfast, sing it for lunch, sing it before dinner. And so like that anthem has just like always stuck with me. And I find myself singing it sometimes, just walking around. So it's like this haunting anthem, which is like so embroiled within like childhood and innocence and Christianity. So when I was like thinking about this character Johnny, who's going to be like this kind of maybe like the antithesis to like those kind of embellishments, like innocence, childhood. Like when I think of Indigenous childhood, like I don't think we register Indigenous childhood registers in the same kind of temporal template that perhaps the suburban white het cis child does, where they go 0 to 18, then you become an adult. When I was working with kids in Selkirk for the friendship centers, I had kids coming in who were like 13, 14, overdosing on painkillers. And I was like, Indigenous childhood, or like I guess what we call childhood, ages Indigenous children, even from the get-go, from the beginning of colonialism, in a wholly different temporal register. So I really wanted to play with that. And so I just took this ideal of like this kind of innocent child who sings these sing songs for grace before they eat like their bread and butter. And this haunting anthem in my head. And I was like, I am just going to make the most unabashed, sexy glitter princess I can imagine, who really doesn't abide by rules of innocence and is really kind of celebrates their body, even though they're told not to so many times within the book, right? And embraces perhaps what Alicia was talking about in her essay about like selfies and nudes and whatnot, and just kind of bring that to the forefront. And it all started with like little 8-year-old Josh being forced to sing these little Christian anthems in Camp Arnez in Manitoba.
Great, thank you. So another question about your book structure and some things. Alicia, you wrote a collection of essays. So, but the flow was still read like a novel. It read like a book to me. It seemed to make sense. How did you decide to put those essays together? Were they written at very different times? And that's something I'm curious about as well. And for Josh, I really found it interesting that you used a very colonial system of Roman numerals in your chapters, and they were just done in Roman numerals numbers. And I'd like to know your thinking behind that.
Yeah. Okay. So I guess I'll just go first. Basically, I started writing essays before I knew that I was writing an essay collection. And I feel really bad because my husband had always told me, and I always have to bring this up because I just have to acknowledge that sometimes your husband is right. So he had told me, in my case, my husband's right a lot, but he's like, you should write a memoir. And I was like, a memoir? Like, I was just had imagined it as kind of like, you know, I the way I talk about it always is I had imagined it as like, you know, page 1, I was born, and this is my childhood, and this is my adolescence, this is my teenage years, and I'm still alive, so the book is over. Isn't that great? And I just was like, that sounds so absolutely awful to me, like boring. That's the thing, is it like it sounds boring to me, and I'm someone who needs to be constantly like, I don't know, constantly trying to do new things. And so when my husband suggested it, I was like, I don't want to do that. But then later I happened to be talking to another writer, Elliott Safari, who was really graciously just taking like author photos for me after I had just been nominated for a National Magazine Award for one of the essays, for A Mind Spread Out on the Ground, that essay. And she was like, well, you're writing essays, I'm writing essays too, but I'm writing it like the way they're marketing it as is memoir and essays. Have you considered maybe doing it like that? And I was like, no. So basically, from there, I was like, you're a genius. And I rushed home to tell my husband, and he was like, that's pretty much what I told you. I just didn't say it in those words. And I was like, oh. So anyways, when I finally got down and sat and wrote all the essays out, I just focused on making each one as good as it could be individually. And then I knew that I could just kind of, like, because I was writing them all at the same time, they were all kind of coming from the same place intellectually. And so I thought that they would all flow, because that was kind of me kind of growing as a writer as I was writing the essays. And so it would kind of be either way, any way that I kind of structured it would have kind of a cohesion. And so I kind of was like, okay, so I wanted to tell kind of a kind of like a narrative in terms of what I want people to like. It goes from me modeling how I want people to, or like how to look at your own life and contextualize it in terms of the history that you've been in, the pains that you've suffered, you know, and looking at people who hurt you and looking at the ways that they've been hurt too. And so kind of trying to go back and look at the ways that, you know, maybe we can stop these cycles. And I wanted to do that throughout the book, very consciously, starting with, I always knew I wanted to start with the essay of Mind Spread Out on the Ground, because I felt like that was like the framework. And then the last essay I knew that I wanted, once I finished the essay, it was the last essay I wrote in the book, Extraction Mentalities. And I knew I wanted that one to be the last essay in the book, because it kind of, it's a weird essay in that it kind of like speaks to the reader, and then I give lines for the reader to kind of, I'll ask them questions about things that I've, to reflect on things I've asked or things in their own life, and give space for them to answer and write in if they want, or just think to themselves. Like, the space is really more symbolic so that they can take time on the page and in their lives to reflect and do the same thing that basically I've been doing the whole book. And so kind of the way I wanted it was that by the time we've reached the end, they've seen me go through and, you know, and also acknowledge the ways that I've been wrong, and the ways that I've been, you know, embarrassed or ashamed, and say that it's okay. And so, you know, like, we can still, if you can still, as the reader, accept that I can grow as a person despite all of the stuff that I've encountered, then of course you can grow as a person. And that's kind of what I wanted to do with the book. So those were the most important things. And then everything in between, my husband kind of actually went through and basically was like, okay, let's separate, let's figure out what, like, kind of the ideas of these essays are. So this one's about art, this one's about more colonialism, this one's about the, you know, whatever. And he was kind of like, okay, let's make sure that, you know, you don't have all of the art essays in one section and all of the, you know, more personal family essays in another section. So we kind of just went through and we're like, okay, this to this to this to this, so that it all kind of doesn't feel like I'm beating a dead horse, but like I'm growing and circling back and all of these things. So it was kind of, it was very consciously considered, but you know, my husband was mainly the one who did everything other than like the first and the last. He kind of like helped me figure it all out. So I'm very grateful. I have a very good husband. He's a very good writer and very good editor. So.
Yeah, and I guess with mine, in terms of the Roman numerals, so my book is like I didn't know it's like a novel, which we had to put on the cover to say that it was a novel. But I think it's more of like a photo album, or maybe just the ways in which Indigenous people, at least in Treaty One, talk. So it's like, sit down, I have a story to tell you, but before I can tell you this story, I need to tell you this story, this story, all. So it's like cycling back in waves, or in continuums. And I think I speak like that, I think like that, I write like that. So it just made sense to publish like that. So yes, it's a novel, and the general plot is that Johnny is preparing enough money to make, or working to get enough money to go home to the reservation for his stepfather's funeral. And that's the general plot over 7 days. But that really, to me, is not the point of the book. The point of the book is, as Johnny does this, it's more like a series of ruminations, or like a photo album. It's like you're looking at, this is what happened here, this is what happened here. So you like, it's a 7-day journey, I guess, but the larger scope of the novel is like this kind of the epic life of Johnny as a character, from childhood through to the contemporary day and everything in between. So I'm really kind of like playing with this idea of like temporality or time again, and how orality or like storytelling breaks apart that. And I think we all know during quarantine, like, time is a colonial construct now, as all days blend into one day, right? Well, we had known this, but other people are seeing this, maybe non-Indigenous white folks. The 9 to 5 doesn't count as much as Dolly Parton wants to sing about it. I love Dolly. I jest.
She didn't want the 9
yeah.
to 5 anyway. She's revolutionary. She's over it.
It's true. So I wanted to kind of, when I was making this and writing it out, originally I was using like little dots of eyes, and then it just kept getting larger and larger and larger. Then I was like, okay, well, I want to play with the clock and break the clock. So I was like, Roman numerals for me signal like the time on a clock. My grandmother always had these like Roman numeral clocks. So I was like, let's use that. It's super colonial. The structure of a book is super colonial, and like beginning to rising action to the denouement and then down to the climax is also a super colonial structure that's never worked for me. So I'm like, let's take these little structures, let's put them together, and then I'm just gonna like maybe like I'll inject Johnny into this, and he's gonna expand and break the hell out of it. And that was what I wanted to do. And I always say my kink is to have like a glass or two of wine, then go read Goodreads reviews. Because everyone's like, this isn't a novel. It's not, doesn't make sense. Nothing is in order. And that was exactly what I wanted it to be, because this is how I talk, this is how I think, this is how my community has conversations. And this for me was the best way for me to write, but also at that point in time, the most applicable way for me to decolonize the form of the novel.
That was great. I didn't think that it didn't make sense or it wasn't in order. That didn't come to me, but you said that it was that 7-day journey. I missed that part of it. I knew that it was, so that's really interesting to me. Thank you so much. Okay, so my next question isn't really a question. I like to ask questions that aren't questions. It's kind of like one of the discussion items that I said I wanted to talk about. I wanted to talk about Indigenous writers in Canadian literature. You both, even more than your book, I liked writing your acknowledgements and your thank yous. They warmed my heart. And for me, as an aspiring Indigenous author, just to see the path of the people that come before us, I just have so much honor and respect, and for the work that you guys did. And I just want to know more about your experience about getting into Canadian literature and what that was like. Alicia, you went into a lot of detail of your struggle for Indigenous authors in Canadian literature, and I loved reading it, and I definitely am very grateful that there's some authors out there that I have never read their books, and I definitely don't plan to. And I found that, I was just telling my friend here, that's all I read is Indigenous literature now. And I have to thank the Festival of Words. They've opened this to me that I didn't know it existed. And when you talked about your first woman Indigenous author you read, Alicia, I just felt every word that you were saying. That's exactly how I felt when I read Katrina Vermette. So, as I said, it's not much of a question, but I know that you guys will have lots to say about that.
Oh, yeah. Do you want to go first, Josh?
That'd be great.
Sure, yeah. I just think like I always make this joke, like sometimes literature needs to be spelled like accountability, because I don't think we write in vacuums. I don't think no one's a singular born genius that was like meant to be a storyteller. Like that romance of the writer.
Yeah.
Also the romance of the writer as this isolated person who just like has these muses. Writing is painful, writing is exhausting, writing costs the body, and when I say body, I mean mental health, physical, spiritual, emotional, so much. Like writing is a very painful process, and that's something that's really taught. And also, in order to publish Johnny or Full Metal or my forthcoming book, I can only do that because of the labor of many Indigenous writers, and many of them Indigenous women and Two-Spirit writers, who are often kind of, I would say, put into the peripheries, because we have, maybe I would say Canadian literature likes to uphold people who are amazing in their own right, but like Richard Wagamese, who was the first Indigenous writer I ever read. I love him, but also like we need to like broaden the scope as well, so we don't forget writers like Christos or Sharon Prowl Turner, who are often left on the peripheries, who did the groundwork for us to be able to be in the space of Indigenous literature and Indigenous publishing and Indigenous run issues. So for me, yeah, like the acknowledgement section was a way for me to pay homage, respect for those who have paved the way for me, for those who I'm working contemporarily with, like Alicia, and then also for those I'm mentoring and helping for the next writers to kind of take the mantle that we are holding right now, or take the fire that we are holding and like burn down the industry of Canadian literature even further, I guess. So it's all about, again, it's like interconnection and reciprocity and cyclicity. And for me, yeah, the acknowledgement sections was that. I needed to kind of verbalize that humility and that thankfulness to those who paved the way for me, and sometimes often in ways that were unrecognized or misread or misconstrued, or just straight up like didn't have another publishing run. So for those who are all in the back, I would say read them. They were amazing. Specifically, the Two-Spirited Indigenous women writers. I owe so much. We owe so much.
I kind of feel like Josh pretty much said everything because, I mean, you're just amazing. So I don't know that I necessarily need to add too much, but I will just say that, you know, very similar experience to Josh. I just think that, you know, once I knew that it was out there and I could start looking at Indigenous literature, specifically, and I want to say as well, Indigenous women and Two-Spirit and queer folks, you know, I feel like their writing really resonated with me in a way because, and I don't like, you know, no disrespect to the Indigenous men who have been very successful. They have worked so hard for their success. They have fought and, you know, scraped, and you know what I mean? Like the stuff they had to endure was absolutely unimaginable. And they, you know, the fact that they had to deal with that and just keep a smile on, and they were not allowed to, you know, speak back in the same ways that we are allowed to now, or not even necessarily allowed to, but we have the opportunity to, and we have more support to do that now. They weren't allowed to do that. So I just want to make sure that I acknowledge that because also there were certain things they weren't allowed to write. Like, for example, Maria Campbell, we just heard that she had the section of her autobiography, Half-Breed, which was so like a huge bestseller in Canada. It was huge. And they would not let her publish anything that talked about being sexually assaulted by RCMP, even though that was her life. So like, you know, you have publishers being put in positions where they are editing out, they're literally editing Indigenous lives to make them more palatable for white audiences. And so I feel like it's very important to, you know, look at how the power was much different in those days where they, you know, where now Maria Campbell is able to say, put that back in and have people listen to her. Then she was not allowed to do that. And so, you know, it's important we situate these things when we talk about Indigenous writers who came before us, who were the first, because, you know, some people, I think sometimes people forget how different it was back then and what they were allowed to do, what publishers actually allowed them to do, as opposed to, you know, what they wanted to do. And I think that for me, you know, thinking about what they would have wanted to do if they didn't have to fight so hard to get through the door, if they didn't have to allow people to edit their lives for them or edit their voices or, you know, make it softer and more palatable. What would they have been able to accomplish if they didn't have to do that? That's what I think about a lot. And so, you know, I really want to make sure that we acknowledge that and acknowledge the difficulties they had fighting so that we could be here and be like, you know what? I don't want to write about being, you know, about, you know, how, whatever, like, I don't want to write the things that white people want me to write as an Indigenous writer anymore. I want to do something cool. I want to, you know, break down the boundaries of structure. I want to, you know, write Full Metal Indigiqueer, you know, or like, you know, do some of the stuff that Ariel Twist is doing, or Billy Ray Belcourt, or Lindsay Nixon, you know what I mean? Like Jay Simpson, all of these people are doing such incredible, amazing work. And they only are able to do that because these people came first and did that awful, grueling work that no one wants to do, but the first people have to do it every single time. And I'm so grateful for them doing that work. I know that a lot of them don't get, I think, the credit they deserve for doing that work. And I think sometimes, you know, people, even Indigenous writers who are looking back on their work, sometimes I think forget about what they had to do just to get in their foot in the door, so that we could take that and wedge it open and just break the whole door down. Like they needed to get in there first so that we could all come in. And I just really want to, you know, make sure that, you know, we acknowledge that that is what was necessary, and also acknowledge that, you know, the people who were allowed to do that, for all the people that were allowed to do that, there were so many other people who weren't allowed to do that and who we didn't get to see books from, we didn't get to see art from. and they had important things to say too. And I think that, I'm really glad that we have more opportunities to do that. I think there's more willingness for publishers to really really critically think outside of what they imagine Indigenous literature to be, and ask us what we envision Indigenous literature to be, and that they can just kind of give us that to do it with. You know what I mean? Like, I feel like that's the role publishers should be playing. What do you want to do? How can we help you do that? Instead of, this is what we want you to do because this is what's going to sell. And I do think it is changing, because I also think that audiences don't want the stuff that they've been telling people that they want for so long, and they want to see what new creations we can come up with, what our literature can look like without any restraints on it. And so, I just kind of wanted to mention that. I have so much love for, the people who came before us. There's been so many people who have helped me. Success is not something that happens by itself. No matter what anyone says, if they are self-made, they are not self-made. They had people behind them that were supporting them, that were opening doors for them, that were giving them advice, that were, editing their work. And, I just think that I love reading acknowledgements because I like seeing that too. And so I just wanted to make sure that in my acknowledgements that I acknowledge that my book was not created in this, like, the idea, exactly what Josh was saying, of like, the independent writer who doesn't need anything except for, grit and determination to get it done. Like, no, that's stupid. Like, that's not what happens. There's a lot of doubt. There's a lot of like, I don't know if this is working. Can you come and look at this? Like, you know what I mean? Like, that's what happens. And those are the people who I think, it's important that we demysticize this idea of like the great artist who is impeccable and who can't make mistakes. We make mistakes. We are vulnerable. And, and I'm sure that even maybe there's stuff in here that, like, I'm sure if I were to go through and reread the whole thing, there might be stuff that I'm like, I wish I could like change that now because I've learned more, and that's okay. Because that was a moment in time that it reflected what I was thinking then. And we're allowed to grow and change. I think that that's something that, I'm really excited for. Seeing all of the indigenous literature. There's so much good work coming out. Like, I can't even keep up with it anymore. And everyone is doing different things, new things. And America too, the indigenous literature is exploding in a way that I feel like it hasn't had the opportunity to do in a long time. So I'm very, very excited for everything that's coming, essentially.
Thank you.
That's
Thanks for
great.
expanding
Thank
on
you.
what I meant too.
Yes.
I appreciate that.
Before we started here, I'd mentioned land acknowledgements, and I don't love doing land acknowledgements. And as you're both sharing, I said, as Indigenous people, I think we should acknowledge our people who come before us. And then all the non-Indigenous people, you keep doing the land acknowledgements and going into what that means and the actions. And as Indigenous people, we need to acknowledge all those that come before us. That would be important. So I'm going to push for that, I think. We are running over time. I have got some permission to go a bit over. You may still want to give me a bit of a time because I could probably go all afternoon if we wanted. There is 2 questions online here I do want to ask though, because they're great questions. Here, Donald Campbell. Joshua, do stereotypes that some heterosexual people have ever factor into how you portray two-spirit characters?
Stereotypes about queer folks that heterosexual people have?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I guess so. This is something I'm working on with my new book, Making Love with the Land, which is slated to come out fall of next year. And thinking about, so I identified when I first came out as gay, and then identified as queer, and none of those fit because what those words automatically signal to me, specifically gay, is like white cis men who are like basically in queer as folk, which I talked about in Johnny, live in these like lofts in New York City, and like they go to bathhouses every night, and they take their shirts off and dance on pride parades on the back of banks that are actively colonizing indigenous queer folks. So I was like, cut that. Queer for me as well also started to signal a lot of whiteness. It started to open up for me ideas about gender. I think queerness is a little less cis, but at the same time is still invested in things like queer utopia. So like let's flee to Vancouver or Toronto or San Francisco or New York City, which is another type of colonizing gesture. And then it also disallows allowance for queerness in rural areas like the prairies, where I think it's really important and valuable to be an out queer person in these spaces without having to flee these spaces in order to kind of live our lives. Right? We can live valuable, powerful, queer lives in the spaces of rurality as well. So I gave up on queer. And then I started to ask myself, like, am I queer enough to be queer? Am I queerer than queer? Like, what does two-spirit entail to me? Oftentimes asking how the gay and queer and LGBT, which a lot of Indigenous folks do identify with. It's just not for me, because I asked the question, like, whose rainbow flag is that like pocked within? So yeah, I started to gesture more towards two-spirit. And when I was writing Johnny, two-spirit for me just fits right now, because one, it's a sovereign way of identifying myself as queer, but also as someone who doesn't conform to gender binaries, also as someone who's accountable to his communities. So it's more just about who I'm attracted to and who I sleep with. It's a whole slew of identification and gender identification and sex and sexuality and community reciprocity, and community engagement, which is so much more than I'm gay, I sleep with men, right? So like, yeah, when I was trying to write these, when I was writing Johnny, those very much were in my mind. It was like, okay, like how do I portray what I might call queerness, I guess, or two-spiritedness in a way that is true and respectful and powerful and sexy from an Indigenous perspective, primarily a Cree, which OG Cree perspective, right? I didn't want to conform. So I opened with queer as folk right off the bat because I was like, this is what we know, and you're not going to get any of that. You're going to get bear topping scenes. You're going to get two-spirit dreams. You're going to get, I didn't want it to also just be traumatic, but you're going to get some trauma. You're going to get sexiness. You're going to get topping for the first time in the back streets of the res or the back roads of the res. And I was going to stay true to the prairie-ness of Johnny's Creeness, I suppose I would say. And then wanted to show like that maybe what Johnny calls home, which is the res, which is the urban res as well, are spaces ripe ripe with queerness, that have allowances, that cherish it, that's perhaps sometimes dehumanize or demean it, but then also spaces that allow for such beautiful transformation. And in that transformation, a kind of rippling effect, I suppose I would say. So yeah, I had those stereotypes in mind, and I was like, we'll start with it, and just right off the bat, like, fuck that. This is what you're gonna get. So yeah, just wanted to kind of stay true to queer prairie rurality, I suppose, and over like the urban gay man dancing on the CBC or a CIBC parade float.
Great answer, thanks. And Alicia, there's a question here for you. Our festival intern is interested to hear more of your thoughts on ways we can transform the cultural perception of beauty and desire surrounding women, especially that idea of non-consent being desirable.
Well, I think that, I feel like the more that, the more that individuals have power over their own images, and also, I guess, visibility and things like that. Those are important things for people to do. But I also think that, visibility only goes so far. So it on one hand, I think back to, for example, I know that, Lena Dunham has all sorts of problems, but, when I was younger and I was watching the show Girls, I remember seeing her naked body. Like, she just doesn't care about nudity. So she was always naked, pretty much. Well, not always, but like she was very regularly naked on the show. And I remember at first being like, oh my God, she's not like amazingly model, like her body doesn't look like a model's body or a porn star's body. So like, I didn't know what to do with that. I was very like almost embarrassed for myself in the ways that like, I was just like, I would not want this to happen. And the funny thing is like by the time that the show ended, this is so funny, but there was like, I remember I was in like a Value Village trying on like, some clothes or whatever. It's 50% off day. I had to get my sale on. And I remember just like the door didn't totally latch, and I was just in my like little bra and panties, just like, you know, whatever. And my door just kind of fell open and my whole ass was out to like the people out there. And I just kind of turned around and was like, oh, sorry about that. And then just like closed it up with just like me and my little like underwear and stuff like that. And I remember being not embarrassed about it. And I remember thinking that it was because of being exposed to stuff like girls and seeing different bodies and being like, you know what? If she's okay with her body, and I don't think anything is wrong with her body, then maybe nothing is wrong with my body. Maybe I can be okay with my body. But I also think that, you know, on top of that, like while visibility is important, we also have to do internal work around decolonizing our own ideas of desire. And I talk about, every time I talk about this, people get very angry about it because there's this idea that desire is inherently immutable, like you can't change it, and whatever you're attracted to is what you're attracted to. And I find that very interesting because on things like, you know, I'm not on necessarily dating apps, but I know that, you know, when my brother was single, he's a gay man. Oh, sorry, hang on. Okay. My thing came up. My brother's a gay man, and I remember he would be on dating apps, and you know, there would be things like no spice, no rice, which is like a racist way of saying they don't want anyone who is East Indian or who is East Asian or South Asian. And I just was like, what the hell? Like, how could you honestly sit there and say you're not attracted to any East Asian or South Asian person based on the fact of their race alone? And when I started thinking about that, I also started thinking about, you know, like, why is it that I thought, for example, that only, you know, skinny little white boys were hot? Or why is it that I couldn't look at, you know, like a chubby native guy down like that I knew of and be like, you know what, he is sexy. It's not just about like, he doesn't have to look the way that, you know, I've been told that idealized sexual desirable beings should look. And I think that, you know, the more that we do that work on ourselves and think like, wait a second, why am I attracted to this? Am I actually attracted to this? Or is this something that I've been told and so often that I'm attracted to that I've been led to believe it? Or am I really disgusted by that person's, like, you know, fat or their acne or whatever, you know, am I really disgusted? Is that really inherently disgusting? Or is that something that I've been told to believe and have internalized and made it so that I don't want to look like that either? And I'm projecting that insecurity onto that person's body, which has nothing to do with this. They're just trying to live their damn lives. They're just trying to be sexy. They're just trying to, you know, do all of this stuff. So, you know, what are you projecting onto other people's bodies? I think that that internal work is something that is much more difficult than representation. And but it's more valuable because of that. And that's something that we all have to work on. And it's not going to be easy. It's something you have to do individually, but it is worthwhile because, well, let me just tell you, you know what I mean? Like, once you stop seeing all of the ways that other people should be ashamed of themselves, you stop seeing the ways that you should be ashamed of yourself in those ways that are similar. So I think that, you know, it is worthwhile. And also, who doesn't want more people that they could potentially, you know, end up having a great sex escapade with? You know what I mean? Like, I can say no, I shouldn't say that. Never mind. I was going to say, I can say from experience. Okay, no, I will say that. I can say from experience that I am having better sex as a fat woman than I ever did as a skinny little thing. So, you know, that's all I will say.
I love it. Thank you so much. So I'm just going to give each of you a few moments for a few last words. Alicia, I do have a specific few last words I'd love to hear from you. I would like to know about your new, I believe it premiered yesterday. Was it yesterday? Your up-and-coming podcast? Why Though? Could you tell us about that, please?
Oh my God, yes, I love it. Okay, so basically, I just wanted to do something fun. Like, I write these essays and they can be very serious, but I was just like, I need something that can like express my ridiculousness, and so you know, while also still like, you know, talking about things that are important to me. So I ended up being I get along really well with my brother's boyfriend, Greg, and I call him Greggy. I just came up with that nickname recently. So anyways, me and Greggy just get along very well. And I was just like, we should just start a podcast. Let's just start a podcast because we all we'll just sit there and talk politics for like forever. And then we'll also just move into like pop culture and stuff like that. And I was just like, let's just make this a podcast. And then my other brother's girlfriend, who happens to be like in journalism, is just breaking into it. She was like, I'll produce the podcast. And I was like, great, let's do it. So basically, we just did our first episode, or we just put up our first episode yesterday, where we talked about basically, defunding police, specifically talking about the city of Toronto and their hesitance to do the right thing. There was also Toronto City Council who voted not to defund them and to give them more money. So we talked about that. We talked about the Devontae Miller case. And then pop culture, we just talked about Animal Crossing, which was really fun. And Josh had listened to it, and it made him come up with a conspiracy theory about Animal Crossing, which was really fun.
Solid gold, yeah.
So I'm just happy to have something where I can just be funny and goofy and just like, also serious. But I just want it to be something for people to be like, something uplifting where you can like learn about things, but also just have fun. I feel like we need more fun. So that's kind of what I was thinking with it. I'm really excited to do it too. So I hope people like it.
Great. Thank you. And Joshua, any last words on any up and coming work that's coming out or anything you'd like to say?
I guess I would say this fall with Arsenal Pulp Press, which also published Johnny, we have an anthology of two-spirit queer or indigiqueer writing about utopia, so it's speculative or sci-fi, coming out. So this fall, 2020, a lot of emerging Indigenous writers. Alicia mentioned one of them, Jay Simpson, among many others, 8 others. So stay tuned for that. And then next fall, as I mentioned earlier, I have Making Love with the Land coming forward. So essays about mental health, indigeneity, queerness. I do interrogate desire as well.
Yes.
So stay tuned.
I just also want to say really quickly, I've read in advance that anthology that Josh is talking about, and it is beautiful and amazing, and everyone should read it. So yes. Oh, I think you're on mute.
Or you're muted.
Muted. See, I knew I'd do that at one point. I just wanted to say thank you so much. We talked about everything under the sun, and I couldn't imagine anything different with Alicia Elliott and Joshua Whitehead. I hope I get to meet you guys in person one day. And thank you very much. This has been fantastic. And thank you to the Festival Awards, and thank you all for joining us for lunch and a bit more time. Have a good day.